All right, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today for Getting Started with Threat Modeling Lessons Learned. So, have you heard about software threat modeling and you now want to know more? Or has your organization said that you need to start threat modeling your applications, but you aren't quite sure where to start? Or maybe you've tried threat modeling in the past, but you just gave up because it was too manual and time consuming. When it comes to software application threat modeling, Security Compass senior solution engineers Brandon Triance Haldane and Adiran Thermal have pretty much seen and heard it all. Today, Brandon and Adiran will share threat modeling lessons our customers have learned over the past several years as they've helped our customers design and implement software threat modeling programs at scale within their own organizations. So as we begin today, let's quickly go through some housekeeping items. You'll receive an email with a link to the slides and a recording of this webinar after the event today. Please do ask questions. We'd love to hear from you. And to ask a question, type your question in the comment box. And also note that the way the comment box looks may vary based on your platform. If you're joining us via LinkedIn or YouTube or Twitter, for example, we'll answer questions real time during the discussion as much as possible. And any of those questions we can't get to, we'll try and answer at the end. And finally, if you've got a topic you'd like us to cover in a future webinar, just drop us a line. We'd love to hear from you. So my name is Maureen Shawala, and I'm the Director of Product Marketing here at Security Compass, and I'm based out of Houston, Texas. And with me today are Brandon and Adiran. Brandon is a Senior Solution Engineer based in Toronto, and he joined Security Compass back in 2016, and he's worked with many large SD Elements customers in both the commercial and US federal government spaces. And prior to joining Security Compass, Brandon studied computer security and digital forensics and worked as a solution architect at a small independent software vendor. He also has a super relevant English Lit degree. So he's your guy if you're ready to talk literature. Adiran is a senior solutions engineer based in Vancouver, BC. And Adiran is a seasoned application security engineer with 8 years of experience in cloud services and static and dynamic analysis and telecommunications, who joined us here at Security Compass about a year ago. And like a good old predictable Pacific Northwest resident, Adiran says you can usually find him at his local coffee shop. So in our session today, first, I'll spend just a minute or two making sure we're all on the same page about what software threat modeling is. Then we'll dive in a little bit on why you actually need to care and why you need to care now about software threat modeling. And finally, after we kind of do this little bit of a level set, we'll spend the rest of our time here today really having Brandon and Adiran share with you what you need to know about software threat modeling if you're just getting started, based on some of those lessons learned across the multiple organizations they've worked with who've all been busy implementing threat modeling over the last couple of years. So first of all, let's take just a minute and talk a little bit about what threat modeling is. So many of you are probably familiar with OWASP, but if you're not, according to OWASP, or the Open Web Application Security Project, OWASP is a nonprofit foundation that works to improve software security and threat modeling. The OWASP definition is when you threat model, you're really working to identify and communicate and understand threats and mitigations within the context of protecting something of value. So think of a threat model as being a structured representation of all the information that affects the security of an application. Basically, it's a view of the application and its environment through the lens of security. And of course, as you can see over here, threat modeling can be applied to a wide range of things like software and applications and systems and networks and distributed systems and Internet of Things and business processes. But really what we're going to be talking about here today is on software or application threat modeling. And so really when we start to dig into what software or application threat modeling is, when most people in the field think of software or application threat modeling, the first thing that comes to mind is the Threat Modeling Manifesto. This was written a couple of years ago by some of the world's best thought leaders on threat modeling, and it really serves as the industry's North Star on the topic. And so here I'm just going to read from this slide just a little bit. So according to the Threat Modeling Manifesto, threat modeling is analyzing representations of a system to really highlight and identify concerns about security and privacy. And at its highest level, the Threat Modeling Manifesto is really focused on 4 key questions. what is it we're working on? What can go wrong? What are we going to do about it? And did we do a good enough job? In other words, it's trying to understand all those potential different avenues of attack someone could use to compromise an asset, and it's focused on producing an appropriate set of countermeasures that could be implemented as a result. But now, when most people think about software or application threat modeling, the first thing that tends to come to mind is a diagram. So, for example, in the golden oldie pre-COVID days, back when people still worked in offices, people would get together in a conference room and they'd use a whiteboard and they'd start threat modeling together. And they would try and take a picture, and it might take hours or days or weeks to try and get everyone on the same page. And then they would go and try and translate it into a more digital shareable format using something like Draw.io. Or, maybe they used one of the older free tools to try and draw their threat model diagram, something like you see here, which is the Microsoft threat modeling tool, which was developed, about 10 years ago or more. Or they may be using one of the more modern commercial tools, which provide a lot of fresh new capabilities around automation and scalability and enabling faster development of threat modeling diagrams and identification of countermeasures. So I think that's one thing to kind of highlight here is, although you may have some old memories of threat modeling has really changed a lot in the last couple of years, and it's not your mother's threat modeling anymore. And Brandon and Adiran will be talking a little bit more about that. So why do organizations threat model? We've talked a little bit about what it is, but in terms of why organizations today are really focused on threat modeling is that they're being asked to release software faster than ever before, while still ensuring that the software they release meets an ever-increasing number of security and compliance requirements. Increasing cyber crimes and hacking has led governments, including the US government and industries, to introduce new regulations that really are focused on threat modeling and secure software design. There's been increased adoption of a lot of new technologies, including infrastructure as code, a lot of new cloud technologies, etc. And that's led to a shortage of experienced security practitioners. Also, all of this new and changing technology has introduced new vulnerabilities, which makes it hard for people to keep up to date. And product teams are spending more time on security and compliance requirements than they ever have before, which means they have less time to spend on features that really drive growth for their organization and also make it hard for them to stay competitive. So to address some of these challenges, organizations are turning to threat modeling because it helps deliver very real and tangible benefits. It helps them release secure code faster by automatically identifying and prioritizing software threats. Gone are those long hours and days of drawing on whiteboards. It helps enforce security controls consistently across teams. It helps reduce the risk of insecure design by empowering developers to take more responsibility and ownership of security and understand how to make their products more secure by design. And it helps continuously improve security for every release. But now that we've talked about what threat modeling is and its benefits, what is it really? Why should you personally care about threat modeling? So, according to the State of Threat Modeling, which was a research survey conducted by Gulfdale Consulting, an independent third-party research firm, last year almost 80% of respondents said that threat modeling was a top priority, and 58% of respondents said that they really do threat modeling every release. And then 71% said they thought the amount of threat modeling they would do would continue to grow. So what this really means for you and why you should care is that if you aren't already threat modeling your software or applications by the end of this year, it is probably coming your way very, very soon. And as an illustration of that, there's been, just within the last year or two, a significant increase in regulatory focus on threat modeling. So, for example, in 2021, in response to the US President's executive order on improving the nation's cybersecurity, which you're probably hearing a lot about, EO 1428, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST, published a recommended minimum standard for vendor or developer verification of code. And here you can see on this slide some of the key points highlighted. This is pulled right off the NIST website. And as you can see, it lists threat modeling as the first of 6 recommended techniques for verification of code by developers. NIST also issued guidelines on mitigating the risk of software vulnerabilities by adopting a secure software development framework, or SSDF, and it also recommends threat modeling to help design software to meet security requirements and mitigate security risks. And last but certainly not least, and you'll see this sort of orange box here at the bottom of the slide, in the United States, the Office of Management and Budget issued guidance in September 2022, so just a couple months ago, that requires US agencies to start collecting attestation letters from software vendors for critical software by June 2023 and for all other software by September 2023. So even if you haven't been following along on EO 1428 or the latest NIST standards, I strongly encourage you to start doing so and really understand how your organization is likely to be impacted by these threat modeling requirements in the next coming year. And then last but not least, whether you're an application security professional or a software developer, you really need to care about threat modeling because it's likely to be coming to your doorstep soon. We all know that security resources are very scarce across organizations. Here you can see as a general rule of thumb, in most organizations, the ratio of application security professionals to cybersecurity professionals is at least 101. Some more recent studies like the BSIM 13 report, which was published just a couple of months ago, found that there's typically, one software security resource for every 122 developers and 43 applications. So you can see there just simply aren't the number of application security resources out there, which means securing your software and threat modeling is going to become more and more a part of a developer's everyday job. And if you haven't happened to have seen this already within your own organization, probably it's time for you to buckle up. It's coming your way, and it may be there much sooner than you realize. So now that we've talked just a little bit about what threat modeling is and its benefits and why you should care, we're going to go ahead and kick things off and turn things over to Brandon and Adiran, and they're going to share with you some threat modeling lessons our customers have learned over the past several years. And hopefully these will help you as you start to look at implementing a threat modeling program in your organization, or if you've already gotten started with threat modeling, hopefully some of these lessons learned can really help you improve and scale your threat modeling program if you've already got one in place. So with that, I'm going to kick it off. We're going to cover 7 key lessons learned. And the first one we're going to focus on, lesson number 1, is identify your objectives and know what you're really trying to do and why. And so with this one, I think I am going to let Brandon tackle this one first. This was one the team thought was probably the most important. So Brandon, tell us what you've seen and heard around this piece.
Sure. Thanks, Maureen, and hi, everyone. I think that what's so important about this is that as much as we would like to go and make everything secure, the truth of the matter is that that's probably not realistic, right? We can't really try to boil the ocean in our organizations. And in a world of agility, security just can't be the only objective of threat modeling. We have to think about things like efficiency as well. The analogy would be if I send a contractor into my home to do some renovations, but don't give that person any indication of what the end state needs to look like, we're going to spend a lot more time than necessary getting things wrong, adjusting them, and kind of get into this sort of build, break, fix type of cycle. And so coming up with these, metrics or ways to measure the efficiency of a program, understanding, what the scope of the threat modeling activities need to be are really important. And I think that, if we could, we would obviously love to do a really deep, manual, lengthy analysis of every nook and cranny of every application that we're building. But organizations just aren't built that way. They don't have the time, they don't have the resources, and they don't have the money to do that. So when it comes to thinking of what your objectives should be, I like to ask a lot of questions. And besides, how do we measure it and what are the appropriate metrics? We need to think about things like how long should threat modeling take? How often should it be performed? What proportion of the portfolio needs to be covered, and how do we decide what that proportion is? How much time are we spending remediating testing and pen test findings today? And would we like to reduce that? How can we go about reducing that? And I think another key thing, and of course, we're going to have a few more lessons that relate to this, but another key thing is how do the decisions that we make in threat modeling impact development and speed to market and these types of things? And I think we need to find the right balance between all of these things so that we're creating secure and robust products by design, but we know kind of what our objectives are and how we're going to measure them as we get started.
Yeah, and just chiming in on that, the contractor analogy I really like, and I don't know if you've ever walked into a house where the light switches are just a little bit too low, and so you have to kind of like crunch down to get the lights on. So there's in any project, whether that be renovating a particular room or building a brand new product, there's a few things that are very high on the priority list, and creating that priority list and then ideally attaching some type of a dollar value to it is going to be absolutely awesome and allow you to be able to really just walk through that whole product, start to finish. What's it going to cost you to bend down by 3 feet every single time you turn on the light switch? And there's the equivalent of those across various software projects, and being able to identify critical services, and potentially it might be things like uptime, latency, and then being able to think about some of those other objectives from a security perspective as well, and having those top of mind. Ideally, when you're laying out the blueprint and creating the design to renovate the room, rather than when you actually have the contractor in place and you've got the 5 different heights drilled into the wall already. That's a little bit tougher to deal with, and so. Yeah, I think we've got a few more lessons, so I'll turn it back to Maureen here.
Okay. And before we move on to the next one, just quick question for you, Brandon. What might you say some of the more common objectives folks have for their threat modeling program that you've talked to? Does it vary widely, or is there some consistency?
The truth is, I wish I could say that more people have thought about these objectives. And this is one of the reasons that it's a lesson learned, is because often when we're talking to, folks who are interested in building out the programs, I'll ask the question just very bluntly, how big is the problem? Or how do you know kind of where the problems are? And oftentimes they'll say, well, it's really about just reducing the number of vulnerabilities. And that's important. But if we put too much focus on that, then of course, we're not thinking about efficiency and delivery and these sorts of things. So I think having objectives in terms of reducing the time it takes to threat model, and you might do that through automation, which we're going to talk about in a subsequent lesson. Coming up with ideas about who should be involved in the threat modeling, and whether you want it to be kind of a security-led initiative, or more popularly, as we're starting to see, more developer-led kind of self-service type initiative. So I think it's really important to think about the things that you're trying to achieve, why you're trying to achieve them, and then how you can get there before you try to start, kind of building the program out and try to boil the ocean and secure everything, as they say.
Right. So it sounds like this seems to be a step that maybe, in your experience, Brandon, people have tended to skip a little bit and not think as deeply at the beginning of the process as they need to. Is that a fair statement?
For sure, because I think in the security world, we're always thinking security first. And so it's about the number of vulnerabilities or the number of pen test findings or this type of thing. But, we live in the world of DevSecOps now, right? So everything's kind of combined, and we can't have that singular focus as much as we used to. So getting people to think outside of that and think about efficiency and effectiveness as well as secure by design. Time to market is critical. If your competitors are beating you to market, even if they have a buggy, insecure product, if it gets to market first and people like it, then they're already ahead. So we want to try and factor in these things about efficiency as we're building out the program, so that we're both to market faster and more robust and better when we get there.
Okay, great. Thanks, Brandon. Now we'll just keep things moving along, and we'll talk about lesson number 2. And I think Darren is going to kick us off with this one. But this was one Brandon and Darren came up with think beyond the pretty diagram. So Darren, what does that mean and why is that important?
Yeah, so thinking beyond that pretty diagram, when we kind of think about diagrams, they can do one of a few things. The idea is to be able to understand information from the diagram. Sometimes you can go overboard, or sometimes you can go a little bit too vague on that front. I think we've all seen the classic project of just that black box, and you've got a line in and a line out. And I know in the engineering classrooms that I sat in, that was a very common example. And you always kind of wonder, okay, what's going on, what's happening. And then there's always the opposite of that as well, which is kind of thinking about the diagrams that get generated through static analysis or even through dynamic analysis flows, where you're walking through every single nook and cranny of your code base and being able to actually see all these micro components that might not actually ever be used, but are still relevant. And thinking beyond the pretty diagram is being able to find the ideal balance between the two, right? And so ultimately, when it comes towards diagrams, it's difficult to convey a ton of information in them without having to force folks to bust out the magnifying glass and take a look into the diagram itself. And that's where ideally the diagram has a purpose. It conveys some quick information, but then in terms of actions that a developer needs to take, or an operations engineer needs to take, or a DevOps engineer needs to take, ideally that shouldn't be in the diagram. Annotating the diagram with all these like lengthy instructions and notes makes it super cluttered and prevents it from being able to be easy to understand. And I think there's ultimately a bit of a different format sometimes for that, where ideally, if you can go in towards your Jira backlog or your GitLab or your GitHub environment and be able to see some of those issues, and have some of the instructions that you might need to think through show up there, where you're naturally going to be thinking about functional requirements, and other things that you need to do as you translate that blueprint into a actionable piece of code. Ideally, the instructions can be there, and then that way the diagram can be saved to remain pretty and quickly look at and be able to understand. So it's a tough balance, but Brandon, I'm kind of curious in your thoughts on this one.
Yeah, I really agree with a lot of what you said there, Adir. And for me, when I'm looking at a diagram, what I'm typically seeing are infrastructure components or architectural components. And so my brain automatically wants to go to infrastructure or architectural solutions to those problems. So like WAFs and ACLs and firewalls and things. The diagram is not going to show me a specific, function that has that fails to sanitize user input or something like this. So I think, when we look at the diagram, your brain kind of lives in diagram world and doesn't necessarily, I mean, for some people, maybe it might just be me. But I certainly, that's where my head goes first, and I have to go to that deeper level. And as you say, the diagram doesn't really inherently communicate anything about the changes that are required, so much as what the current state is. So we can start to think about what a future state might look like, but it doesn't really communicate requirements to developers. And ultimately, somebody has to spend some time doing that. And even, some of the tools that are available, that do sort of a diagrammatic approach, they may identify that a threat exists in a particular interaction or in a particular component within that diagram. But we need to be able to take that next step and say to our colleagues in development, there may be a threat here, and here's what we would like you to be able to do about that. And we just can't take the manual time to come up with those things that historically has been the approach. I also think that once we start to scale, like in really large organizations, I've heard horror stories about Zoom meetings or WebEx meetings or whatever, with like 80 to 100 people sitting there on the meeting as one person draws out the diagram and solicits feedback from this group of engineers. I shudder to think of what something like that costs at that kind of scale. And I know from some of the customers that we have that it just wasn't working from a productivity perspective either. Just way too much time spent creating that artifact just to then have to analyze that artifact to go that next step that you're talking about. So certainly diagrams are great. They do a good job at what they do, but we can't just stop there when it comes to threat modeling. And frankly, not everybody has the think like an attacker mindset to be able to look at a diagram and understand it both from the perspective of infrastructure and application.
All right. Great, Brandon. And now I think we're going to go ahead and we're going to move on to lesson 3. And I think this is kind of a nice segue to some of those things you just touched on, Brandon. Center on the developer. What do you really mean by that?
Simply put, there's more of them than there are of you. I have yet to ever work with an organization that has more security folks than developers or engineers or product people. And so we need to leverage that population. And what we can't do is have friction between, development teams and security teams. And I hear about this all the time, Adir, and I'm sure you do as well, where it's almost like an adversarial relationship where the development team is under pressure to deliver features on a timeline, and security, that they're kind of the big bad folks who are standing in the way saying you can't deploy yet because of A, B, and C. And so what we need to do is center the process around the developer, make it easy for them to self-serve, make it easy for them to consume. We don't want to create friction, and we don't want to have this adversarial relationship. I've seen situations where, security folks, after having done an assessment, they might create, they might run a scan rather that may provide like hundreds of findings that the development team then has to work through and triage and kind of figure out whether it's a legitimate finding or whether it's a potentially a false positive. And at the end of the day, in a lot of organizations, development has to estimate the amount of work that they're going to do. And it's really, really hard for them to make any kind of accurate estimate if they have no idea what's going to come back from a pen test or from a code scan or something like that. So the more we can build this process around the development team, solicit their input, solicit their feedback, really cater to them with clear requirements, and not just requirements, but also guidance on how to implement those requirements, that creates a much friendlier sort of situation between the two groups. And, I think it's also key to make sure that we're targeted in what we're delivering them. Don't just provide them with a PDF or a wiki that says, here are all the mandatory requirements. We need to come up with things that are targeted and specific to the technologies they're using and the data they're handling and all these sorts of things, so that we have both scalability in terms of their population, but also an effective kind of working relationship between the two groups. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, our goal is the same, which is to create secure, robust, compelling products that get to market, quickly and ideally win that market. Adiran, what are your thoughts on this one, centering around the developer?
Yeah, and I think one of the key ingredients to achieve that is empathy. I hear that from organizations that are gigantic, with trillion-dollar market caps, and even organizations that are, much smaller. Empathy is huge, right? And being able to be empathetic towards your developers. They're ultimately getting inundated not only from a security perspective when it comes towards non-functional requirements. They're getting inundated through legal requirements, privacy requirements, accessibility requirements. There's a whole host of different things that developers have to deal with, and being empathetic to what they're going through is huge and really significant. And I think in double clicking on one of the things that you said there, Brandon, being able to incorporate and speak in a language that developers can actually understand is hugely important. So, going up to a developer and giving them a whole bunch of legalese is not going to necessarily achieve that ideal result. Conversely, talking about a specific security standard or security concept and, giving that to the developer and expecting them to be able to, in their head, do that translation into how they need to action that specific concept is really difficult. And that's where, if you can, as you approach your development teams, come to them in a way that you're talking about specifics from a language perspective, specific issues that might exist, and how to actually mitigate those issues within that language. And, you can definitely also go overboard with this where, you might treat your developers like little children and you're super prescriptive on what they can and cannot do. And, of course, with with the whole low code, no code type approach, we might get to a spot where code is just kind of inherently there for developers. But, as at this current state, developers do have, a ton of intelligence. You're hiring developers for specific reasons, right? And one of those is because they're able to help deliver your ideal product or your ideal service to market, hopefully quicker than some of your competitors, and in a timely fashion where your customers are going to purchase it and leverage it. And so being able to be empathetic towards the developers is huge, because realistically, they're usually after a really similar goal to you. They want the products that they're creating to make it to market, and also stay on the market, right? When it comes towards attacks or specific, issues that might arise. And I think we're seeing that a lot with privacy these days, right? As a lot of privacy regulations are being created, and then those are being pushed on towards specific organizations. And you can always point the finger back to the developer and say, hey, you didn't think about this. Why didn't you think about it? But taking that empathetic approach and being able to get in front of that and being able to see, hey, this is what's potentially going to come around the corner. Let's start thinking about it. This is how I think we should attack it. And approaching it in that fashion would be awesome. So.
Oh, it sounds like too, this is a pretty different shift. In the past, maybe traditional approaches to threat modeling have been more centered on the application security team. But, again, based on the ratios between application security and development, it's really time to shift that thinking and have it become much more focused on the developer. Okay, great. And then if we dig into lesson number 4, Adiran, I think I'm going to let you go with this one. It isn't one and done.
Yeah, so unfortunately with the security world, it is not a static space, one where, attackers use the exact same patterns. Actually, I heard a really good lesson earlier today where, locks on a door are really great for honest folks that, are going to turn the door handle, notice that the door is locked and walk away, maybe give someone a call, something like that. But unfortunately, attackers don't think like that. They're not going to, look at a locked door and say, okay, well, this isn't open for a reason, let me walk away. Instead, they're going to look for a window. They're going to look for, maybe a back door or maybe a little, alleyway or something to be able to actually get in. And realistically, it isn't a one and done. The way in which attackers are going to be trying to attack your applications, whether they be web applications, mobile applications, even as you position those applications in towards cloud services, right? Like, it's not a one and done. It's not a static space where the way in which you architect from a security perspective today is going to be there for the complete long haul. You have to come back and think about how things will change. And this is where, when we go back towards that diagram that we talked about earlier, when you create that diagram, ideally not through the 80-person meeting like Brandon described, but when you create that diagram, that's a one singular point in time. And realistically, not only are attackers going to change, but the application itself is going to change as well. Potentially there are going to be some new services that you want to add, or potentially there might even be some microservices that make and enable the product to come out to the market faster. And so, that one single point in time, the analysis that you do there is not going to be sufficient. You need to go back time and time again to be able to reevaluate. And unfortunately, when it comes towards threat modeling, it's always been done in a very waterfall fashion where you might do it once at the onset of the product. You might do it once a year, maybe, or you might do it right before you have to get that specific compliance measure. But unfortunately, what that leaves is a situation where as your application changes, as attackers change, and as the world ultimately changes, you leave yourself open to attack. And yeah, ideally, if you can create the flywheels and the mechanisms in place to be able to threat model regularly, as new features get added in, to be able to reevaluate, how does this fit with our larger objective? And, when we kind of think about those really tough threats that exist within that specific product, how does this change that we're about to embark upon affect that? And what can we do to potentially architect some guardrails or some safeguards to allow our product to be in front of customers, but still be safe, to not have to go back to them, unfortunately, as a lot of organizations do. I was sitting in a hotel chain, sleeping in one of their beds as they got attacked, and opened my email to get that email to say, hey, sorry, dear customer, unfortunately, your passport information, your credit card has unfortunately been leaked. It's really unfortunate. And it's tough, right, as a customer, to have to deal with that environment. So.
All right. Thanks, Adiran. And to keep things moving along, we got our lesson number 5, which I think Brandon is going to speak to, which is automate to scale.
Absolutely. And I think this is really related to the last lesson as well, because I don't know about you, Adiran, but personally for me, when I talk to organizations and I ask them, how frequently are you threat modeling today? In a lot of cases, it's, well, we're not, or it's ad hoc, or yeah, we get to it about once a year. And part of the challenge with that is that a lot of these organizations haven't implemented any sort of automation. They're still doing things in a very expert, human-driven kind of way. Which can lead to some great results if you've got the time to be able to do it. And if you've got the resources, you're able to hire enough people, and you've got the money to pay those people, and so on and so on. So when we talk about lesson number 5, automating to scale, I don't think I probably need to tell anybody on this call. I think we all know what the benefits of automation are, but we just can't have a linear relationship between the size of the organization and the size of the sort of security organization. It just doesn't happen. So we need to find efficiencies. There are lots of other reasons besides speed and efficiency. I mean, we could think about consistency, for example. If you've got 2 expert practitioners looking at the same threat, they may come up with different ways to try and address that problem. One way may be a little more valid than the other, or maybe simpler than the other, or may provide a more comprehensive set of mitigations than the other. So having that consistency, I think, is really important. Automation lends itself to logic and to consistency and repeatability. So I think that's another good reason beyond just speed and efficiency. I also think that easier auditing is an important reason to automate. If we know that a system is going to behave in a certain way, like given input A, we know we're going to get output B, that's a lot easier to audit than to have to go to someone who maybe assessed a diagram and said, well, based on my experience, I think we should do this. Whereas someone who's more experienced or with different experience, they may choose to solve the problem a different way. So again, the consistency and the ease of audit, I think, are good reasons to automate. And the last one that comes to mind for me, at least right away, is integration. I spoke a little earlier about the idea that even if you have someone assessing a diagram and kind of figuring out where the threats might lie, the next piece of that is, well, okay, what are we going to do about it, right? If we think back to the 4 questions, someone is going to have to probably manually create these tickets in issue trackers for developers to follow and that sort of thing. But if you can implement automation, maybe that's a step that you can remove. You can leverage automation to identify threats, to identify relevant countermeasures, to put those countermeasures into related systems, to track the statuses of those countermeasures, even to track the verification status of those countermeasures through integration with automated scanning tools and things like that. Not to belabor the point here, but I think we're just way past the point where any organization of any size can do these type of threat modeling activities manually. And so, if you're going to hit scale, if you're going to start covering a larger proportion of your portfolio, or perhaps ideally the whole portfolio, automation is going to be what gets you there. Do you think that? What would you add to that, if anything, Adiran?
Yeah, and I think in terms of the automation, the other thing to kind of note, especially going back to that infrastructure piece, is there are a lot of moving parts, right? And so being able to automate your process in such a way that if you pull out kind of one of those key elements, that you're not kind of left kind of standing trying to figure out what to do. Thinking back to that old testing methodology where you literally pull the plug on your critical server and see how the rest of the system kind of works to be able to fix that issue. I think it's really important to do and think about from an automation perspective as well, right? Because that is one of the key benefits through automation, is that if you are able to architect it appropriately, then if you move your environment from your in-house servers in towards the cloud, or if you're switching between cloud providers, or even if you're switching language stacks, right? You're able to take those huge moving pieces and be able to deal with them appropriately. How does that actually impact your threats that you're working on, and what do you have to do from a countermeasure perspective to actually mitigate what's happening? And yeah, I think there's a lot of benefits to automation, but kind of thinking through those missing pieces, it's unfortunate, but there's a lot of details there to kind of think through, and hopefully having a tool at your disposal to help you with that automation is a quick way to help. It's not going to be a silver bullet by any means, but it'll hopefully help ease your threat modeling process.
All right. And now I feel like we're back a little bit here in elementary school or middle school, or maybe I'm having high school math flashbacks. But lesson number 6 that y'all are recommending is be prepared to show your work. And I think this one, Adiran, is your advice.
Yeah, no. So, yeah, I remember long division, and whether those are fond memories or tormenting memories, I still haven't quite decided yet. But when it comes towards compliance measures, unfortunately or fortunately, as from the perspective of the consumer, organizations are asked to really show and validate what they're doing. From a PCI perspective, there are varying degrees of QSAs, unfortunately. But at the end of the day, a lot of those QSAs are going to be coming to you to ask, what have you actually done? If you, as an organization, declare that you're encrypting data at rest, and ideally the tough QSA, or I guess the QSA that advocates for their customers, are going to ask that question. Okay, how do you do that? And dive into some of those details. And unfortunately, when it comes to organizations that don't have a very robust threat modeling program and process to it, it's really difficult, because as that QSA asks that tough question, all of a sudden you have to scramble to try and answer that question. And conversely, if you do have that ideally automated threat modeling program, if your QSA introduces a brand new threat that you might not have thought of, introduces a brand new countermeasure that you might not have implemented, then you're able to apply that in towards your mechanism and be able to ultimately deliver that towards the developers or the operations or DevOps folks, and allow them to take the appropriate action, and being able to showcase, how that actually flows, and ensuring that, folks can't go in and delete those logs, all the good stuff that our compliance auditors will request it and kind of really push for. It's really relevant, and being able to show your work in terms of not only what you did, but how you did it, when, by whom. It gives you a huge advantage when it comes towards a lengthy audit, and hopefully you'll be able to go through some of those audits or some of those compliance measures and come out the other side with that stamp of approval, and be confident in the fact that you're going to be receiving that year after year, release after release, product after product. Brandon, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this.
So I agree with that wholeheartedly. I do think that showing your work is partly about due diligence. And I mean, let's be honest, sometimes things happen, right? The best laid plans and all that sort of stuff. So being able to show that you've made a good faith effort, that you're doing your due diligence, showing exactly what countermeasures you've selected and why, I think that stuff's all really important. The other kind of way that I think about this, though, goes back to the relationship between security and development. A lot of times I'll talk to organizations where there's that adversarial relationship, which is not great, something that you definitely want to get a handle on. And it can be very helpful to be able to explain if a developer says, or a development team, an engineering team says, well, why do we have to implement that control when this other team didn't? Or these types of questions, or like, how is this relevant to my application? We don't want to just say, you have to do it because I said so. We don't want to be the enforcers. We want to be the trusted security advisors that the developers are going to look to for assistance. How do we make their lives easier? How do we make it more straightforward for them to understand why something applies to their project and how it should be implemented? So I think in terms of being able to show your work, it is both about auditability and due diligence, also a little bit about forging those relationships, having the empathy that you talked about, Adiran, and being able to have a collaborative, productive conversation with other stakeholders, even business stakeholders for that matter, who may say, "Hey, we need this shipped. Why are we slowing it down with X, Y, and Z?" Well, if we can show our work, then that helps us justify the work that we're asking development to implement. So I think just kind of another perspective on that same thing.
All right. Thanks, Brandon. And a few questions have popped in, but before I start digging into those, let's see if we can tackle our last one. Lesson number 7. Free isn't always free, but free is always good, isn't it?
Free is always good. I'm not going to complain about free. I have to give full disclosure here, first of all. I love free and open source software. I first started dabbling with Linux about 25 years ago. It's been my primary desktop OS for about the last 14 or 15 years. Love it. Big proponent, huge fan. However, though it is free, I wouldn't say that I've paid nothing for it. I have, in fact, paid for using open source software with my time. I tend to find that free and open source software often requires a little bit more care and feeding. And the other thing to keep in mind here is that if I run into a problem while I'm using free and open source software, usually that means I'm turning to a message board or to Reddit or maybe to the abandoned issues section of a Git repository or something like that. I don't have that that commercial support team waiting for me to get in touch and to help me out quickly. So when we talk about free, I think if you're gonna automate, if you're gonna use tooling, you are gonna pay for it. You're either gonna pay for it in terms of time, in terms of productivity, or in terms of money. And I think that at least the nice thing about money is that it's often a little bit more predictable than those other things. If you're using a free or open source tool and you suddenly run into a snag that prevents anyone from doing any threat modeling for a week, what's the impact of that on the organization? What does that cost? It's pretty hard to try and extrapolate and figure out what lost value might be there. Whereas if you've got a contract and you know how much that contract is going to cost, that's a little bit more of a predictable, bit more of a predictable cost. So I certainly think that there are some amazing open source and free tools out there, but we have to be careful about how when we look at those and think, wow, it's free, I can implement all this stuff. There will be a cost to it. And frankly, I think one other thing that bears mentioning here is that I've assessed quite a number of free and open source threat modeling tools. And the biggest gap by far that I find between those and some of the commercial offerings is the level of detail involved in the findings. So lots of these tools may say, okay, well, this component of your system may be vulnerable to a tampering threat, or this interaction may be vulnerable to spoofing. And that's kind of the end of it. It's then up to either the practitioner who's using the tool or perhaps the development and engineering organization to figure out, well, okay, what are we going to do about this, and what are we going to implement? I think that the commercial tools that are available tend to be a little bit more robust. They tend to provide more context about why something might be applicable to what you're developing. a little bit more context about what should be done to proactively prevent that weakness from entering your application. And also, nothing beats a code sample, right? If we can provide developers not just with what to do, but also some direction on how we would like it done. If you've got reusable code patterns in your organization, being able to supplement whatever is included in the out-of-the-box database with your own content will certainly be an easier lift than having to populate an entire database of a free or open source tool that maybe doesn't ship with all that guidance by default.
Yeah. So, what's your perspective on it, Darren? Is yours similar to Brandon? A little bit different?
No, definitely similar. And I think when it comes towards that cost of free and open source tools, especially from a threat modeling perspective, coming in the form of time, I think there are some organizations that try and combat that by overlaying a lot of services on top of their actual use of that tool. And it becomes really unpredictable, to Brandon's point, right? In terms of, how much time you're going to have to pour into using a particular tool to be able to drive the value. And then we also have to think about, one of our earlier lessons around being able to do threat modeling time and time again. When it comes towards free tools, unfortunately, they might not necessarily have that same level of upkeep that some of the commercial off-the-shelf tools would have when it comes towards guidance. As the security landscapes change, as technologies, languages, containerized environments, cloud services, all the new buzzwords that everyone kind of thinks about. Unfortunately, those free threat modeling tools don't always keep up to date on all of those, and it becomes difficult. And potentially you might solve it. You might get on the other side of the hill, and have actually resolved the use of that free tool, and probably rests on a few key folks. And realistically, with everything going on within the market, unfortunately, people do move around, right? And so, having a very critical process like your threat modeling rely on a few specific individuals becomes really difficult. And being able to ideally use a commercial off-the-shelf tool that has some robust services to help ensure that the tool is able to be implemented time and time again is really beneficial. It just adds that predictability. I think that's huge, what Brandon said around having that predictable nature when it comes to the tool, not only the cost of the tool itself, but also even in that output, that you can predict that it's going to provide a robust and relevant output for your developers. So yeah, unfortunately, there is no such thing as a free lunch, I guess.
Well, with that too, I want to make sure we've had a couple of questions come in. So just wanted to make sure we had a chance to get those covered before we start wrapping things up here. One of them, I think, was in response to something, a comment that Brandon made earlier. And the question is, what are y'all seeing in terms of the percentage of a company's portfolio that they're actually threat modeling for? That's kind of a question.
I'm almost embarrassed to give the answer on that, as the folks who I talk to are almost embarrassed to give that answer as well. It can vary. We do speak to some organizations who will say, "Yeah, we're covering pretty much all of our critical applications," and the critical applications might represent 10, 20% of the overall portfolio. More often, what we're finding is that organizations are performing threat modeling ad hoc in general. And even if they're covering that entire critical component of the portfolio, it's probably still only once a year. The numbers, I think, are improving over where they were 2 or 3 years ago, but it is often a pretty small proportion of the portfolio, and again, probably not as frequently as is required. And it'll vary. Like in heavily regulated industries, obviously they need to try and do it more often. And that's where they can run into issues of scale and that sort of thing. So I think that efficiency and efficiency leading to scale will help organizations be able to do more of the portfolio and do it more frequently. But yeah, the numbers today can be a little bit grim sometimes.
Okay. And Another question which is sort of related, kind of another one of those percentage questions, I guess, is when you think about it, what percentage of organizations that y'all talk to are actually doing automated, what we would consider automated threat modeling by our definition versus manual? Do you guys have a sense of that, or can you make a guesstimate?
I think it starts with like what the definition of automation is. I think that unfortunately is a little bit of a spectrum, right? So there are some organizations that have a bit more of like an automated process to be able to generate some of those diagrams, and that relies on a lot of uplift behind the scenes, and so it's automation with air quotes. And when it comes towards true automation, where a developer, as they're about to embark upon a project, has an automated threat modeling process where they're living in the world of countermeasures and focusing in on actions that they need to take, rather than having to spend a ton of cycles through threat modeling and other security processes. It's very few, I think it's ultimately down to, it's like single digits in my mind, of organizations that have a true automated threat modeling approach, where their developers don't think of threat modeling as this like onerous process that needs a ton of care and feed to be able to generate valuable outputs. But Brandon, I'm curious, any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, no, I agree with you, Adir. And I think that the proportion of organizations that are using some kind of tooling in the threat modeling process is like 75% maybe. But, in terms of what you're saying about like the complete threat modeling process, like that might be, when I say 75%, maybe 75% are generating a diagram with some kind of tool and some inputs. But then, the what are we going to do about it part is still done manually. I would agree, single digits for like a sort of end to end, like, let's be proactive and prescriptive about identifying potential weaknesses before we write the code. Let's figure out what the right requirements are. Let's get those into the backlog. Let's track them throughout the backlog. Very, very small number of organizations that are automated to that level today, but lots of desire to get there. And I think that that's important. People are starting to see more and more that kind of that's where the game is moving, is to the faster, more automated approach.
And the next two questions I think are pretty similar, and I think, Brendan, maybe you've asked them already, or I'm sorry, answered them already. But it's how often are most people updating their threat modeling, and like kind of how frequently are they threat modeling? I know you alluded to it's a little different based on regulated versus non-regulated industries, et cetera.
Yeah, so like for example, I've worked with a couple of medical device companies, and they have certain FDA requirements that they have to meet in terms of when they threat model and what that looks like and that sort of thing. But there are large organizations that you would expect are doing more threat modeling and doing threat modeling more frequently, and they say, yeah, we get to it as often as we can, but because it takes so long, and because we're under these tight timelines and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, all the all the typical barriers to doing it more frequently. I would say that there are a lot that maybe threat model once a year.
Mm-hmm.
And even then, it's like, as I think Adir and you pointed this out earlier, like if you're threat modeling once a year, you're almost not threat modeling at all, because there's drift in terms of configuration, there's drift in terms of adding features to our software, there's drift in terms of the threat landscape and what new weaknesses and vulnerabilities are being discovered all the time. So really, not enough people are threat modeling as often as they should be. And mostly what I hear is if they're threat modeling regularly, it's about once a year.
Okay, thanks. I think we have time for one more question, and then we'll start wrapping it up. And I've been kind of jotting these questions down here and doing a little bit of prioritization. So kind of this one's I guess our last one's a wee bit of a two-parter. So where are software threat models typically stored and shared, and how do developers actually use these? How do developers access them and use these threat models? What do they do with them?
So that is going to where the first part, and Adir, and I'll pass this to you in just one second. But the first part, I think, of where are they stored, that's going to depend greatly on your tooling. So I talk to a lot of organizations where every team is using a different tool. Somebody threat models in Visio, somebody threat models in Draw.io, someone threat models in Lucidcharts. And so those end up just being files that get passed around on a network or something like that. And that is really not ideal, because then you get into versioning issues and all sorts of other things. So in a best case scenario, certainly you want things stored centrally in a platform, somewhere where there's nowhere it can get lost, right? Somebody will have kind of permission granted to it, and they'll know where it's going to be. As opposed to, even with some of the free tools, of course, they'll generate an artifact, but then that artifact is a thing that we need to track. I have also, and then I'll pass to you, Adir, I've also heard of organizations that do that sort of thing. They will sometimes try to store the threat model artifact in the repository. So that can maybe work, but again, then you're getting into versioning issues potentially, like if somebody uploads an outdated version or something like that, you've got multiple copies of the file and you're always hoping that you're using the latest one. So certainly like a centralized platform, I think is the best way to go there if possible. Adir, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, when I thought about that, my mind immediately went towards those whiteboards with PLO, please leave on. And there are many customer sites pre-COVID that I would go to. And, you would see that kind of on, right behind the meeting room that you're sitting in is, a critical document that is at the whim of a sales engineer potentially reaching for that whiteboard eraser and completely eliminating that threat model, unfortunately. And I think there are a lot of organizations that rely on, those manual whiteboards, or I think that's become a little bit more virtual nowadays. But relying on that single kind of picture artifact, and then deriving kind of the action from that, so like, what does a developer need to do? They might be little notes like on that whiteboard, or potentially post-it notes that you might, attach to that whiteboard. That's what I've seen in the past, organizations that are using much more robust, automated, scalable format. Of course, they're relying on developers to have Jira tickets, GitHub issues, GitLab issues, and ultimately having these traceable, trackable, actionable items that developers have. And ultimately, all of a sudden, those countermeasures from a threat model perspective become treated at the same value as a functional requirement, right? Where, hey, this is what we need to do. This is what we're going to work on. And of course, there's different things like amount of time, different priorities, so on and so forth. But I think with robust organizations, developers see that where they're working on a regular basis, like Jira or other tools.
All right. Well, I appreciate you all sharing your lessons learned. I see that we are a little bit out of time. So for folks who are with us, again, to learn more about software threat modeling, please don't hesitate to reach out and ask to speak to one of our Security Compass experts. We have several, Brandon, Adirin, several other folks on the solution engineering team are more than happy to answer any questions you have about getting started with threat modeling, what they've seen. Maybe if you're already doing some and you want to know how to do it faster or in a more scalable way, they'd be happy to help. And also, please feel free to visit our website. We have a lot of threat modeling resources available out there. Just go to securitycompass.com/learn threat modeling, and that will take you to a lot of additional resources, everything from case studies and demo videos and white papers and research reports, all designed to help you scalably model software threats and improve the way you deliver secure, compliant code. And last, but certainly not least, many thanks to all of you for joining us today to learn more about these lessons learned over the last few years as we've been working with our customers to implement threat modeling programs and then help them scale them. And certainly many thanks to Brandon and Adirin for taking the time to share their experience with us today. So with that, I think we'll go ahead and wrap things up. Thanks again, Brandon and Adirin, and this will conclude our webinar for today.